This is one of the great mysteries, how the brain, as we believe, creates consciousness.
You can almost see it as being a trick of nature or even an illusion. The brain is fooled into believing that it's still sending information to part of its structure that is no longer there.
Having studied biology, the fact that the pineal eye is present in lizards and other animals is simply an accepted fact.
I'm Emeritus Professor of Neuropsychology in the University of Bristol. I used to be at Cambridge, and I'm also a Fellow of the Royal Society, so I like science in general.
The pineal eye seems to have first been described by Brant, Edwards and Dukes in 1829.
Well, I've read a bit about it, I think it's fun, the pineal eye.
My name is Steve Nichols. I've been working on the mind-body problem in philosophy and related areas such as neural computation in computing and in disciplines such as psychology. I work as a hypnotherapist. I'm interested in all aspects of consciousness. Phantom eye theory, or medium vision theory, MVT as it's nowadays referred to, solves a long-standing problem in Western philosophy known as the mind-body problem.
The modern brain has replaced the functions of the primal median eye by a trick of generating a phantom or virtual sense organ using the old primal median pineal eye as its template.
You are just a beast.
The world knot is the name given to the mind-body problem by the philosopher Schopenhauer because strands of the problem reach into areas such as psychology, religion and theoretical physics. It's not just a problem for philosophers. This affects everybody.
The median eye owes its name to the midline location between two parietal bones.
The pineal eye isn't constructed the same way as a modern lateral eye, since it has no muscle to control direction, no eyelids so it can't be closed, and no iris for focusing.
It is indisputable that pineal-eyed creatures can be traced back through the fossil records, at least to the jawless fishes of the Ordovician age.
The fact is that our direct ancestors, Cotylius or the stem reptile, had a single pineal eye and a gland.
The sphenodon first appeared in the fossil records about 200 million years ago, and since then they've not really changed at all. They're actually older than the dinosaurs and are in fact the slowest evolving of all the higher vertebrates.
Pineal eye in the young sphenodon seems to be the main collector and relayer of sense information concerning events in the outside world, such as transition from day to night, winter to summer, which is important for hibernation, and the proximity of predators. And also recent experiments in California have shown quite clearly that yellow-tailed lizards whose pineal eye is covered can't find their way back to the burrow. It seems to be able to detect sudden movements or shifts of light that inform them of an impending danger. There are disadvantages for a cold-blooded animal who has a physical pineal eye. For example, if behaviour is governed entirely by the quality of sunlight and the availability of body warmth, then damage to the exposed sense organ could lead to behavioural incapacitation. The median eye was lost in mammal-like reptiles as they crossed the reptilian-mammalian boundary.
Previous to the loss of the pineal eye, it had not been possible, for example, to visualize an object although lateral eyes are closed, or to develop depth perception, or to hear our voice without actually speaking. In other words, thought. It is also claimed that this evolutionary atrophy of the median eye heralded in the new phenomenon of dreaming.
It needs to be a complete, unified field theory of consciousness to give an explanation for all types of mental phenomena, which is all sleeping and all waking phenomena. If we think about our distant land-based reptilian ancestors who had a median eye on top of their skull, they were cold-blooded and needed the sun and warmth in the environment in order to be able to move about. At night, when the sun has gone and there's less warmth and the air has cooled down, The cold-blooded reptiles are unable to move about, so remain stationary. We experience this type of semi-paralysis when we sleep and our motor organs no longer function. Pineal eye of our reptilian ancestors could not be closed. It had no eyelids or muscles of control, so it remained open even during the night when it would continue to register the faint light from the moon and stars. This reduced intensity simulation of a daytime activity with accompanying scaled down muscular actions is highly comparable to what modern warm-blooded animals experience during sleep and dream. It's interesting to note that whilst warm-blooded mammals and birds dream, the cold-blooded reptiles do not. They have no REM.
In dreaming, you're effectively cut off from the world, but the same parts of the brain are active if, say, you're dreaming about a visual scene, a beautiful girl or something, as when you're actually seeing that girl or that scene.
Dreaming allows sexual rehearsal without any actual sexual activity. Abstractions allow transformations or manipulations without any alterations to the external world or physical state of things.
So the same brain mechanisms are used apparently in dreaming and in perception, but it's cut off from the control of the senses when you're asleep.
When we dream, the mind continues to register a shadow or fantasy life which resembles or simulates waking life, but with our locomotive and sensory systems disengaged, allowing greater freedom for subjective consciousness. So what we today experience as dreams are our direct ancestors, the stem reptiles with the median eye, would have experienced as just nighttime median vision. The difference being that our dreaming is symbolic in content, whereas the median eye vision of the stem reptile was direct. I mean, it's difficult to explain why dreams happen evolutionarily, because they seem to have no function.
I think we need an evolutionary theory of dreaming, and I think that the pineal eye theory is the only theory I've heard so far. I mean, it's not as if there's a lot of rival theories out there, but pineal eyes are not principally image-forming eyes.
No.
So, since dreams do involve specific imagery, we need to go beyond a mere light and dark sensation kind of eye to arrive at dreaming.
Right.
But I agree that we need some explanation of why it is that we can have a kind of inner light. In the mind, in dreams, we have a kind of light.
My claim is that this shift marks the emergence of a new symbolic dimension that allows animals to be conscious of, but to choose that no immediate action is taken.
And the mind-body problem is simply that. How can a physical machine not only think, but be intelligent, creative, and above all, have consciousness? That's the real tricky problem. This
problem has been intractable in Western philosophy for a very long time. Some philosophers have even argued, for instance McGinn argues, that the so-called world knot is insoluble. Now, the history of this problem really starts with the French philosopher-scientist Descartes.
There had been philosophers interested in the relation between mind and body prior to Descartes. Galen clearly identified the brain's central role in controlling bodily and mental activity. His concept of the pineal gland was as a valve or filter whose purpose was essentially to stop the brain being overloaded with raw experience. Descartes used Galen as a starting point for his own account of mind.
My understanding is really this, that he thought the mind was not amenable to scientific understanding. He thought the mind was something else, whereas the brain he saw as a machine and the nervous system as a machine. And indeed he saw the neurons as tubes with vital fluids and so on flowing through them. He saw reflexes like taps in a water system. In fact, he got this idea actually from some automata worked by water in a park in Paris, and you trod on pedals and then the automata moved around with the water pressure changes. And you thought, golly, that's what's happening to him when he walks around pressing the pedals. The idea was then you had to have an interface between the mysterious mind, which he couldn't look at in that sort of way, and the physical brain, which he could, and he chose the pineal gland I understand, because it's not a divided structure, there's just one in the brain, where most of the other structures are divided across the two hemispheres, in other words, represented twice. Now, since it was unique, he thought, golly, that's the interface between the soul and the brain.
With respect to his pineal gland theory, he acknowledges Galen, but does not mention the more recent writings of 9th century occult philosopher Costa ben Luca, although these seem closer to his theory than Galen's ideas.
What is particularly interesting to us is Costa's belief in the existence of spiritus, which is not spirit in one of our senses of the word, but means a subtle body. Unlike the soul, which is incorporeal, this subtle spiritus perishes when separated from the body.
Costa ben Luca gives the following explanation how processes occur in the brain. The opening between the anterior and posterior ventricles of the brain is closed by the pineal gland. Costa describes this gland as a particle of the body of the brain similar to a worm.
Although there are obvious flaws in Costa ben Luca's account, I feel that his idea of the pineal gland having its own sensitivity of the brain or what's around it, rather like a worm, is quite an interesting concept.
The revision of the importance of the pineal gland started in the 1960s with Wertmann and Axelrod's melatonin hypothesis. It is associated with sensitivity to light, the timing of estrus and menstrual cycles, circadian rhythms and seasonal cycles, jet lag, sleep patterns, with imagination and the amounts of imagination in individual humans.
My understanding is that it can set the activity cycles of the seasons, so it's related to time in that sense. You can get depression in cases where there isn't enough light. For example, Swedish people get pretty depressed in the winter. So I think it sets up, as I understand it, the activity cycle, particularly the sexual cycles, through the year.
In primates, the pineal gland is situated much deeper in the brain because of the large size of the neocortex, whereas in most mammals and birds, the pineal gland is nearer to the skull. Despite having influence over a variety of effects and processes, it is joined directly to the rest of the brain only by a single neural tract. Far from appearing evolutionarily regressive or redundant, pineal glands have been and are about as common in vertebrates, backboned animals, as pituitary glands. This stands in contrast to the pineal eye, which continues to atrophy and disappear.
Descartes got rid of the idea of organising souls or fields and said the body was just blind physical mechanism with a mysterious mental activity interfacing with the body and the pineal gland.
Hobbes, Spinoza and Leibniz in particular made some very strong objections to Descartes. If a gland is a piece of matter, it's of a fundamentally different type than the mental events that were going on.
The only way, according to Descartes, that the hand can be moved is by an initial impulse from the pineal gland, which in turn has been influenced directly by the will. Without postulating some sort of psychokinetic medium between the soul, or will, and the body, Descartes' account seems untenable. In philosophy, Descartes' theory of mind was described as dualist.
In order to be properly equivalent, the two things in question must be fully interchangeable.
This point was first made to Descartes by Leibniz and is known as Leibniz's law. It is not enough to show that brain events and mental events are associated, however close the seeming correlation. For true identity, the two must be fully interchangeable. Only the brain processes can be observed by the neuroscientist, not the subjective experience of a particular human or animal.
Any fantasy or process of creating symbolic representations cannot happen to or in a purely physical body. Like can only interact with like.
We shall find out how median vision theory manages to satisfy Leibniz's law and provide a narrative account of the early evolution of consciousness. The MVT approach seems to tidy up many loose threads of Schopenhauer's world knot, including puzzles ranging through the spectrum from physics to mysticism and religion. There are many examples in world mythology concerning third or mind's eyes. It seems to be universal across cultures, perhaps indicating some hidden knowledge or Jungian archetype.
I think any theory of consciousness has to deal with all aspects of waking, sleeping, dreaming, visions, and indeed mystical experiences.
Odin, king of the Norse gods, gains mystical sight because of the loss of an eye. Ancient Egyptian beliefs include many eye legends.
There's plenty of misconceptions about the nature of the third eye as being a centre of clairvoyance and the ability to see ghosts. And Blavatsky, for example, suggests that in the future humans would evolve on a physical third eye, which would give them this vision into afterlives and so on. I think that most of these theories distract people from finding about the reality, the science and the natural process involved in the pineal eye in evolution.
This is the true beauty of creation. From nothing comes something.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the symbolism of light is present in practically every religious tradition, and inner light is often spoken about. I think it's part of the mystery of consciousness, isn't it, that we can have a kind of inner light. We can form images with our eyes closed in daydreaming and in dreams and in visions.
I want to briefly mention that there's a branch of yoga, the yoga of the third eye, called Shiva Yoga.
The Sahasrara, crown or master chakra, is identified as being the meditational sensory correlate of the pineal complex. Unlike the other chakras, it is not located as being in the body at all, but is located about 2 inches above the top of the head. It is said to be a state of pure consciousness where the Supreme Shiva resides.
When the centre is activated, we see an illusion to the state of experience beyond the mind and the body, seeming a void to the yogis.
The highest sephira, Ketha, from the Hebrew mystical Kabbalah, corresponds precisely with this yogic crown chakra. We find an all-seeing eye of God in the Christian mythos, and also the Dharma eye in Buddhism.
Almost as if one has an internal eye through which one sees not only the external world but the internal world as well. The internal world in terms of thoughts, ideation and also feelings, and taking one step back inside one's own mind and looking at the whole, the external and the internal. To my mind, that's what the eye of Dharma relates to.
Pineal or median vision isn't just a one-way process, not just a looking out or a looking in, an awareness of the environment and of what's happening inside the body. It's a two-way interaction.
Having understood the Buddhist teachings, one understands the constructs that the Buddha was trying to point out that exist in the psyche and in the very gestalt of human beingness, and to actually take a look at those through this eye of Dharma, which in some respects you could say, yeah, it's almost like looking at things through a third eye.
The virtual median eye itself does not exist in the sense that it is not visible in any pure state, since its pure state is void or absence.
Buddhist theology doesn't really go against the pineal eye theories, and MVT in particular, because we find when we actually look internally, we do find a very much a structured, conditioned internal realm.
In his book of Adjurations, Costa-Benluca concludes that suspensions from the neck or amulets are potent not because of any supernatural or occult properties, but rather because of the comforting effect that they have on the mind. I've always maintained that median vision theory was a wholly natural theory.
The brain is a conservative organ which usually retains old parts such as the reptilian brainstem, amygdala and cerebellum, and grows outwards if it needs more structures, whilst retaining the earlier structures. The pineal eye seems to be the only part of the brain that has disappeared in its entirety.
Well, you get, I think, parts of the brain which change their function. For example, there's an enormous area in dogs for smell. That then gets converted to other uses, such as control of emotions. Emotional life is largely controlled by the same region. that is enormously important for smell in dogs. So you certainly get changes of scale. You get one bit getting smaller, another bit getting bigger. But I think you're right. A sort of dramatic loss completely may be unique there. It could be.
The sensory capacity of the pineal eye and pineal gland may have guided the locomotive response of early cold-blooded vertebrates to appropriate environmental temperature. This would include both the local movement, for example, from hot rocks to shade, and also the much greater distances of seasonal migrations.
There are a number of features which make the tuatara different from lizards. They don't have teeth. They have teeth that are made up of the actual jawbone, and they don't have any gums. The males also have no copulatory organ, and they mate cloaca to cloaca, which is the same as birds. They also have a median eye on the top of their head. This is more prominent in the youngsters. When they become adults, it does start to grow over.
The pineal eye in young sphenodons is a structure with all the components of lateral eyes, excepting the iris sphincter and orbital musculature.
It is unlike the eye of a snail that can be moved on its stalk, and unlike lateral eyes, for it has no directional muscles or eyelid. This is a crucial point to understand. To change direction of the pineal eye, the whole head or whole animal must move.
The existence of the parietal foramen in fossils indicates the presence of the median eye. The structure of the parietal foramen in fossil forms such as mammal-like reptiles varies from a simple opening to an elaborate bony ramification approaching a cone. The significance of such buttressing in certain species is uncertain. It may have served to protect the parietal eye, or it may have functioned to enhance exposure of the eye.
In animals in transition away from cold-blooded strategies towards warm-blooded self-thermoregulatory strategies, both their pineal eye and gland reduced in size and function. Disappearance of the pineal eye has been researched in some depth by husband and wife scientists Roth and Roth, amongst others. Their published findings confirm the importance of the role of both pineal gland and eye together in the evolutionary success of emerging vertebrates, as they were required to adapt to thermally variable conditions, including ice ages.
It's possible to document 3 major vertebrate sequences in which the parietal eye has been progressively lost. The first sequence appeared in the Devonian fish assemblage, the second in the Permo-Triassic reptilian assemblage, and the third is continuing amongst some reptiles such as sphenodons. There's an evolutionary lessening in the number of E2 complex animals which occurred in most vertebrates, except for certain small reptiles, under the gradual warming and seasonal climates of the early Mesozoic. The Permo-Triassic events are the most interesting, for it is during this time that the loss of the pineal eye occurred amongst mammal-like reptiles. Loss of the pineal eye seems to have occurred quite suddenly amongst ancestral dinosaurs, thecodonts, but much more gradually amongst mammal-like reptiles. Tolerance of temperature variation is probably as important a factor in vertebrate evolution as food supply.
It is important to emphasize that mechanisms of body temperature regulation are flexible. Ectothermy, which is cold-bloodedness, thermoregulation dependent on the outside, and endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, thermoregulation which is internally governed, are both successful biological life strategies. There seems to be a synchronicity between the two events of losing the pineal eye and the emergence of new warm-blooded animals. Pineal eyes have only ever been found in fossils of cold-blooded species.
E1 systems are found among both ectotherms and endotherms, warm-blooded animals.
More of the thermoregulatory functions became taken over by the pineal gland in both E1 reptiles and in E1 birds and mammals.
Early mammals were nocturnal, and the fact that they could function independently of environmental warmth and light increased their survival chances. Awareness of the strength of heat from the sun and the detection of the time of day, whether day or night, remained important, but was not quite so important. The interpretation of signals from the environment becomes abstract or symbolic rather than direct.
The status of signal from the pineal eye probably becomes weaker as the cellular eye scales over as sphenodon changes from young to adult. The less attention needed for pineal eye messages permits greater self-determination of behaviour by the creature. Many other equally massive changes came about as animals became more independent from direct control by their environment.
Melatonin production may have largely transferred from pineal eye to lateral eyes after the E2 to E1 transition.
We can now reveal the nitty-gritty essentials of MV or phantom eye theory, so prepare for the opening of your third eye, metaphorically speaking, of course.
The organic brain is necessary but not sufficient to produce consciousness. Median vision theory can be summarised by two fairly straightforward claims. One, that the modern brain that has lost its pineal eye but retained its pineal gland instantiates a virtual generic sense organ, virtual or phantom if you like, in the sense that it isn't a physical organ of the body.
It will become more clear what is meant by generic sense as opposed to special particular senses such as sight, smell or hearing.
The second claim is that the template for this virtual, what I call generic sensor, is the old primal parietal, pineal or median eye, the same thing.
Although the old physical median eye forms a basis or prototype for modern consciousness, it might be true that evolution has expanded upon this template or blueprint over the ages. The comparison between median vision and modern consciousness seems to be valid on the most basic levels. The gap left by the median eye provides grounds for sentience and abstract mental representations. Steve Nichols compares 6 basic properties of awareness with some known properties of median vision based on experiments on animals with a functioning pineal eye. The first is wholeness of field.
Now, we do not experience several points of view concurrently, but experience the world from a single vantage point. The ancient reptile only has one median eye. Multimodality in the sense that we can both hear, smell, see and feel simultaneously. Non-transferability in that we don't experience mental representations from anybody else, only from ourselves.
Yeah.
Similarly, an ancient animal with direct median vision, a pineal eye, would not have been able to exchange its pineal eye physically with one belonging to another animal.
Another shared property is having no on-off control.
Even when asleep, we cannot purely decide to dream by choice, and this seems to be an inheritance from the median eye, which cannot be shut off by either muscular impulses or covered with an eyelid because it has no eyelid.
A fifth point is that there is no identifiable place in the brain where consciousness is uniquely situated. The sixth point is that we have awareness both internal and external of our bodies.
The median eye mediates between the two, and this process isn't just a one-way process, not just a looking out or looking in, it's both.
Do you think that it's fair to consider that consciousness is median vision shaped?
Gosh, well, I never thought of that before. I'm not quite sure what it means to say that consciousness can have a shape. What's that mean?
Well, the pineal eye was a template in evolution for modern consciousness, and that it's only by its removal is that the brain is organised, because it developed over such a long time with the pineal eye as a main sensory input. It's actually expecting input from an organ that's no longer there, and so generates it from certain deep structures.
Yeah, I see. Well, it's a nice idea. I think one of the problems of testing it is that we don't know which relatively primitive organisms have consciousness and don't have consciousness. We don't really know when consciousness started. I think that's going to be one of the problems testing it.
Is there any experiments that conclusively prove evolution? You can't rerun history.
Right.
So evolution will always remain a theory.
Yes.
That's a part of the difficulty of the terrain.
Yes, it ultimately depends what you mean by proof. In a way, there's no such thing as empirical proof, of course, actually.
Would my claim that perhaps if you can develop applications from it,
if the theory can generate useful
Sure.
things, that would go some way.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things about evolution. It's got so many implications which are incredibly important. For example, the fact that you can use drugs on one animal and then, and then use them to predict what will happen with us. I mean, that sort of cross-species similarity, it really comes from evolutionary theory, and all that has immense practical importance. Now, you, I think, would want to look for something of practical significance, some prediction that you could make from it. And then, although you might not be able to test each step, if you have a model, a conceptual model, which leads to interesting, useful results, bingo.
The self is just the perception. Again, it's all pointing towards the seat of consciousness. What MVT could be, the pineal eye, the atrophied pineal eye, could be said to be almost like a focal point for all of these interacting elements to come together and form the gestalt of a being.
The median eye atrophied and disappeared so long ago in evolutionary history. It would be surprising if the modern brain and the modern form of E1 consciousness had remained unchanged since these times. And I quite willingly accept that human culture and language and other factors have shaped part of our common mental experience. But what I'm saying is that these are changes in degree, but not changes in the basic processes of cognition. Sensory processing in the brain is what's called generic. So rather than streams of separate special sense data for each sense, sight, hearing and so on, the primary sensory signals, light radiation, sound waves, etc., are translated into forms of signal that the brain can process neuronally.
Well, I think it depends where it is in the brain. The actual activity, as you record it electrically, is exactly the same, whether it's smell, whether it's sight, whether it's touch, or indeed whether it's making your arm move. And you've got things called action potentials, which are little tiny pulses of electricity, and they're exactly the same all the way through. It simply depends really which bit of the brain is active, rather than what that activity, so to speak, looks like. But you're absolutely right, of course, that there is no sound in the head, there's no light that enters the brain. It's all coded by these action potential signals, and then the brain has to decode these messages to make sense of the world.
The interactions from ideation, the interactions from sensation and perception all come together and form, if you like, the actual being. It's a virtual being. We live in virtual reality.
In the primitive Sphenodon E2 animals, the median eye exists as physical substance and is directly in contact with light and the external world. In E1 animals, the median eye effect is achieved indirectly by this simulation or generation of a phantom or virtual pineal eye, rather than by having a physical, what I call a physical mind. There are evolutionary advantages to this. The key difference between the animal with the physical median eye and one that has lost median eye is that internally originating sense data can be experienced in the latter case, the E1 neural system, in addition to externally originating sensory information, which is accessible to both types of animals. An intelligent robot, insect or primitive reptile might survive perfectly well and behave in much the same way as a more modern E1 type animal, which is self-conscious, but without any conscious experience of this behaviour.
Perhaps the strongest evidence for the generic nature of sensory processing comes from work on synesthesia. Synesthesia is the involuntary experience of cross-modal associations.
It's, in other words, a sensation which is not the normal one for that stimulus. And this actually goes against a basic neurological principle, which is called the law of specific energies. That was actually formulated by a German physiologist in the 19th century called Müller. And the idea is that any given nerve can only signal a particular sensation. So that, for example, the eye can only signal light, the ear only sound, the skin only touch, and then you've got other receptors like pressure, heat, and so on. But any given nerve can only signal one thing. It's a very important point. It depends where in the brain the nerve enters in order for that sensation. But synesthesia goes against that, because if you touch, say, your skin and you experience a purple patch, that is some leakage in the brain crossing over and violating Muller's principle.
It is abnormal only in the sense that it is statistically rare. In fact, it is a normal brain process that is prematurely displayed to consciousness in a minority of individuals.
If we try and tie it down too soon to nerve impulses, we actually just end up with more data on neurophysiology, and the consciousness itself disappears.
The brain adds on naming, and it adds on conditioning to what one is seeing. For instance, when one sees a book, it's not necessarily a book, actually it's just a pattern of light falling on the retina, producing electrical signals which are interpreted by the brain. The terminology book, the idea book, comes from our conditioning and our understanding as we've built it of our internal model.
We can measure nerve impulses in squids and in hundreds of kinds of animals, but it tells us nothing about their consciousness. We don't know whether they're conscious or not. And also a lot of the nerve activity in our own brains is unconscious. So I think it's better to start from the phenomena of consciousness.
In a way, from one point of view, all of our experience is hallucinatory or illusory.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we construct the world around us. We've got evidence from the senses, but we're really living in a kind of a fiction, in a sort of story that we create.
So the action of speaking with our mouth closed and talking to ourselves, but without actually talking to ourselves, is an hallucination. The hard problem, to use Chalmers' words, is the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. I tackle this hard problem by spelling out a difference between what I mean by mundane hallucinations and real virtuality. Internal signals give rise to mundane hallucinations when reintegrated by the brain's virtual sensor. By real virtuality, I mean the experience by the virtual sensor of externally originating information received via the special cellular sense organs, visual, auditory and so on. Mundane hallucinations comprise normal dreams, not extreme night terrors, and the auditory hallucination of an internal voice speaking to yourself without opening your mouth. I make a distinction between those and the deficit hallucinations, phantom vision, tinnitus, schizophrenia, LSD experiences and so on.
Very often there is overlapping of the two perceptual types, internally and externally originating. We can be reading the page of a book, external object, whilst internally generating a mundane hallucination of ourselves as narrator, reading the words.
What our hallucinated or internally generated imaginary voice is saying, its intentional content or meaning if you like, depends on background processing elsewhere in the brain.
In the dream case, the visual cortex, or some other brain area, is generating sensory information or signals that resemble externally originating sense information.
The pineal eye grew up with the brain from the very earliest times, so it's reconstructed from this engram or trace memory directly because of the shape of the structures embedded deep within the brain, the very reptilian core and limbic parts of the brain. If you can think of a bus conductor who has a machine that he drops coins into, and there are different size slots through which different coins fall, so that the larger coins are all sorted into the same column and the smaller coins, they roll down. As they roll down, they fall into the shape that fits that particular coin. Now, you might say that that bit of apparatus is intelligently sorting the coins into the different categories, but in fact there isn't an intelligence, an active intelligence there.
Although it might superficially seem possible to observe a whole, this is never the case. You can only see the whole in reference to the background.
What it really is a sheet with a hole chopped as a triangle, and another sheet behind it with a black circle. Gaps at the extremities or edges are perhaps less obvious than gaps in the centre of a body. If this structure had always been this shape, then it would just be in a regular shape. Whereas if it had been an integral rectangular object at some point, then we can say that this area is a gap. This is the integral donut and this is the bun with the missing centre. Identical in all respects except for the way the history and the way they're manufactured.
We may mistake this whole for the background and the procession of events and perceptions seen through it.
And if I was walking on a street in Paris and held up this to my eye and looked through it, I might see the Eiffel Tower or any object at all.
We cannot see a whole itself, but it is necessary sometimes to have a whole in order to see through.
So what this seems to suggest is that pure disembodied consciousness is not possible. No distinction could exist between this disembodied consciousness and its general surroundings.
This whole has definite location and spatial boundaries, but is not composed of any physical stuff or form of energy. So the median eye seems to be another example of a non-physical entity whose existence cannot be reasonably denied, in the same way that a whole is non-physical but can be said to exist.
If the gap is imagined and movable, in other words, if we're selective, it's directable, it overcomes the limitations of its original template, the pineal eye. Sometimes it can be seen that a gap has both functional and physical elements. When some data is missing from a computer memory bank, signals but not substance have gone, but there's still a gap left.
The abstract process, abstraction meaning taking away from or abstracting from the environment that typifies human mental life, is modelled on processes once carried out by an actual physical cellular pineal sense organ.
The phantom pineal eye remains an integral part of the biosphere. Rather than merely being receptive to physical impressions made upon it, its scope is freer, allowing self-determination within the constraints set by the demands of the physical body.
Another example of a gap in the biosphere is that left by traumatic loss or amputation of a limb.
So a person who's had a leg cut off in an operation will feel that the leg's still there. And this is a problem in hospitals after amputation. Amputees often try and walk because it feels as if the leg's there and they fall flat on their face.
The relationship between the pineal gland and the phantom eye is analogous to the relationship between the phantom toe and the stump.
I think phantom limbs are to do with morphogenetic fields, which are the fields that shape the developing body.
I've given some thought to why evolution would think it worthwhile to retain these generally unpleasant feelings in limbs that have been lost in nature, and the possible reason, which I think, is that the earliest types of animals could regenerate limbs, so it was useful to retain the psychological awareness of how that limb functioned and the space that it would occupy to assist the limb to grow back into that space.
Phantom sense organs can occur as well as phantom limbs. Recently there has been some renewed interest in phantom vision cases. Cases of phantom vision have been recorded by science since the 18th century. Subjects report seeing an object, such as a house or person, in as clear detail as if the object was actually in front of them and their eyesight was unimpaired. Tinnitus, or auditory hallucinations following hearing loss, is a fairly common example.
And again, I mean, you can cut the eighth nerve, which is the auditory nerve, and you've still got tinnitus. So it can be evoked centrally by the brain itself.
MVT would suggest that the phantom pineal eye is congenitally arising, in other words, lost before birth, rather than from traumatic loss.
The trace or genetic memory for the pineal eye is still a current property, and that in fact in our own lifetime we actually develop and then lose a parietal skull opening.
The interaction of consciousness with the body occurs, I don't think, just through the pineal gland or even just through the brain. I think it's to do with the whole experience of our body. I think in a phantom limb experience, the consciousness of the limb is actually in the place where the limb seems to be, not inside the brain and then just projected to where the limb was.
Consciousness would still, as if it is a phantom pineal eyes, I would claim, would still carry on even if the pineal gland calcifies or is removed from the brain. The phantom pineal eye might be seen as perhaps a spotlight of consciousness.
The study of physics and the natural world is another strand of Schopenhauer's world knot.
It seems to me that in many ways a lump of lead or stone is somehow more physical than a cloud of gas. Its mass and density are greater and its spatial location is more precise. Obviously in the non-physical region of the scale we would put fictional characters, the legions of gods and devils. I suppose further towards physical we could place Napoleon Bonaparte, who wasn't a fictional character, he was alive but he's no longer around, so he's not physical at the moment. The phantom median eye itself does not exist independently of the brain and the surrounding structure.
Atomic physics or nuclear physics or quantum physics is too low down in the hierarchy of the world or of the universe, and I think really it is the way the neurons in the brain are interconnected, the signals, the action potentials and so on of neurons, which constitute or create consciousness. Now there are people like Roger Penrose, who's a very eminent cosmologist, who believes that quantum mechanics can give the clue. I then kind of ask myself, well, why isn't a table conscious? What is it unique about the brain? You can then talk about certain structures. He talks about little tube things, which he feels are kind of ideal vessels for quantum mechanical principles. But I don't actually buy that. I really think it's neurology that's going to give the clue to it.
It's almost the pineal eye a priori is a barrier to true self-organisation. Removal of this component allows other components previously controlled by the pineal eye to self-organise to a greater extent.
Would it be true to say that in our earlier evolutionary ancestors, their behaviour was very much more controlled by the activities of the sun than...
Sure. That's undoubtedly true. And of course a very interesting thing about animal behaviour, and indeed plant behaviour, is that it's predictive. I mean, you get plants, don't you, starting to come out or be ready to come out in the spring, actually before it's spring. Now how far these are signals which determine it, how far it's got internal clocks, and of course the internal clocks are very important indeed to regulate behaviour. It's a tricky question, but I think what most people say is that there are a whole bunch of clocks in the nervous system, which of course get upset with when you change time when you're flying. This is why you feel rotten when you're flying. Your internal clocks go wrong. Now these are set by the sun, but actually they tool along by themselves with an occasional setting from the sun, and these are called soft clocks, which are controlled from the sun, but you're not dependent on the sun all the time.
It'd be true to say that the evolution of consciousness, looked at it as a process over time, this breaking away of the environmental direct control by the sun is in fact necessary for modern consciousness to evolve.
I would absolutely say that, and I go further than that. I would say that it's getting away from control by stimuli, that is inputs, reflexes, towards internal autonomous activity which can go along within your own head by itself, quite apart from the external world, which makes you intelligent, which makes you able to make decisions, which makes us, in any sense, interesting as organisms, which makes our lives interesting.
All organic brains function, at least on one descriptive level, as electrical circuits.
There's something called the mu state, when the system is actually de-energised, there's no power supplied.
Steve Nichols makes the case that the brain could not have become self-organising in this way if its logic were set from the outside by a lockstep mechanism or external clock.
A thermostat or other thresholding device is interesting in that the finite state, if it is set to this state, is a switch at which it switches on at a certain point. So basically it has two states on or off. If it has no predetermined temperature setting, it is in infinite state. For example, this setting may be determined as a result of a feedback loop or other piece of logic elsewhere in the circuit. The experimental evolvable hardware can actually change the structure of the circuit itself.
The physical pineal eye seems to function as an organic type of external clock in relation to the brain seen as a circuit. Modern self-organising brains would not have evolved if this external clock were still attached.
And it's actually been found that brain structures change to accommodate the new situation.
consciousness seems to have properties consistent with being a field or an analogue infinite state continuum.
There is a fair analogy in saying that the pineal eye acts as an external clock to the organic brain, comparing it with the clocking mechanism in a CPU, yes.
The evidence from experiments performed on RGA circuits and modelling of brain evolution in silicon do seem to indicate what is required for brains to become self-organising. Such experiments do not demonstrate consciousness. After all, RGA circuits are not conscious. However, the presence of REM, rapid eye movement, in humans, with all of its rich accompanying mentation and dream activity, is probably indicative of consciousness in animals. Steve's 1993 MA dissertation first makes the link between loss of the pineal eye, occurrence of REM in early evolution, and the phasic transience, almost random-like activity that takes place in all electrical circuits during the transition from finite to infinite status.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. We certainly, if you look at a dog, and you really do believe it's dreaming, don't you, when its eyes wiggling around with REM.
Well, rapid eye movement sleep is usually taken to be an indication of dreams, and maybe dogs dream in smells as well as sounds and pictures. Who knows?
If these early connections between the core parts of the brain predate the connections through the visual and optic system of the lateral eyes and through the even more recent auditory system, then we can see that it's somehow fundamental to behaviour. In my PhD upgrade paper, Median Vision Theory, the Heretical Philosophy, I go into much more detail exploring the origins of rapid eye movement and indicate how this new appearance coincides with the evolutionary disappearance of pineal eye in nature, and how it's linked to retinal production of melatonin. So, for instance, Michael Menaker points out that the production of melatonin, which is no longer supplied by the atrophied or atrophying median eye, is today manufactured partly by retinal movements, particularly during REM. Median vision theory makes fairly straightforward claims here. For example, an E2 animal cannot dream because internalised mental representations are only possible with the absence of the physical median eye. REM is most often associated with the phase of vivid dreaming during mammalian sleep, but quite a strong argument is put forward by Glubus in his real-time hypothesis, which in brief is that REM occurs throughout both waking and sleeping cycles, but it's harder to detect during the day. It is indisputable that human embryos and newborn infants spend a very high proportion of their life in REM, up to 24 hours a day, during a particular embryonic stage, according to some researchers. Like the hool in the paper isn't fully independent of the background. There's no worm with a separate intentional agenda to the rest of the system, just a virtual lens-like sensor which is integrated with other motor and sensory neuronal systems. The brain may be sending information in pathways that at some early stage of its history would have gone backwards and forwards to the pineal eye. But it's the information now is consciousness.
It is almost a paradox. The infinite state compared with the finite state is right at the other end of a spectrum. I mean, where did the idea of omnipotence come from? But from the human mind, from an infinite state system. It could only come from there.
Well, I think it's a very imaginative, interesting idea. How you go about, testing it in the usual scientific manner, I don't know. I mean, it'd be very amusing just to think what experiments would you do, what observations would you make to test it. We don't know nearly enough about comparative brain anatomy, in my view, and so on. It might point to all sorts of interesting experiments. So push it, It's an imaginative, interesting idea, it seems to me.
In my work as a psychotherapist and hypnotist, I've started using the MVT model of consciousness to have a correct representation of functioning consciousness to detect variance and abnormal functionings, and also it has uses in the development of new hypnotic inductions for use in therapy. And using MVT and Genius software, the computer could hold full information about its own design, circuitry and operation. The machine might then be able to bypass some of its circuitry and continue to function in exactly the same way, but with less components. I have invited conventionalist philosophers and people who say that they disagree with my ideas to appear on this film, and offered them a chance to either contradict what I say or put an alternative case, and none of them have taken me up on this. As a scientific theory, it's open to falsification. You are invited to either find a stronger theory or to refute median vision theory. It hasn't happened so far until I have convincing evidence that another course of evolution took place. I hold that median vision theory is the true account.